What is tracking? By definition, tracking is separating students by academic ability for all subjects or certain classes in a curriculum in a school. This means that each student will be provided instruction that correlates to their academic ability. It's different in every school. For some schools, it's tracking is decided by a student's choice. At some, it's by teacher's choice, and at some, it's by parents' choice. An example of tracking that would be by student's choice is like honors curriculum, where you have the choice between taking a regular class or an honors class. With tracking, teachers focus on individualized instruction rather than collectively teaching the whole group of students, and this is the most widely used method when dealing with student diversity. Here's some background history. The history of schooling. The first American public schools were established in the 1600s. Standardization of these public schools was introduced in 1837, which meant that all these schools now had to reach certain requirements for what they taught. By 1920, 30% of all Americans between the ages of 14 and 17 attended high school. Tracking has been in use for almost a century. It started being used when schools started enrolling immigrant children from other countries, as it was believed that they had less preparation and less capacity for schooling than the native children or the students that were already here. In 1920, some schools had up to 8 distinct tracks that were organized by the children's probable social and vocational futures. Now tracks are mostly used in secondary schools, organized by difficulty. An example would be basics classes, honors classes, and college or AP classes. Unfortunately, track assignments are often decided by many factors other than academic ability. An example of this is race-based tracking.
As we have learned, groups consist of several independent people who have emotional ties and interact regularly. However, in this education system that we have, the group defines and can hinder students from progressing. The tracking system may have worked 50 years ago according to the documentary Waiting for Superman. However, it fit the demands of the time. 20% of the high school graduates were expected to go to college and become doctors, CEOs, and lawyers. The next 20% were expected to go to skilled jobs like accounting and managing. The bottom will become laborers in factories and farms. 50 years ago, college was not a necessity because the World War and Cold War were more pressing matters. However, America has changed so much in the last 50 years and we do not have the same needs that we did before. In a study conducted by Stanford's Department of School Education, they have found that generally Latino Americans and African Americans are found to be in the lower track system. The problem is, if they do not have the resources to advance their education early on, they cannot escape from their future of bad schools, no matter how hard they work thereon after. However, if we combine all classes of all areas, then we will be able to eliminate tracks in order to raise them out of the situation and give them the potential that they need. The students in lower tracking system have a lower self-concept because they believe that they are defined by their academic abilities, especially since America puts so much emphasis on an individual's academic success. This system is unreliable. In a study conducted by Stanford University, the factor that most determines a student's first high school tracking placement was his or her 8th grade test score. Other factors that were significantly related were elementary school grades, attendance, and negative comments about a student's behavior in his or her files. There are so many unrelated components that are factored into the tracking selection process. The fact that 8th grade determines how a student can live his academic life from then on is devastating because it is such a young age, and one's potential could be easily oppressed. All of those caught in the middle have no way out and no way of getting better. The defining groups consequently can have detrimental effects on students.
Okay, so why is tracking in education an issue? Well, it addresses a topic of social facilitation, which means that doing easier tasks gets easier in a group, but when the group is introduced to difficult tasks, it becomes harder for them to do that because they're so used to doing easy tasks together, which doesn't give much space for them to really improve on their skills. This also links to social loafing when grouped, each person contributes less than when alone, which means that they don't use their full potential when they're working on something. They only use a quarter and half because they're around the group and they think that, okay, if one person does it, then I don't have to do that much. And that's not good when you're in an educational setting because you want to always progress further and further and put all your efforts in order to get the most out of your education. And by being in a group, it also leads to de-individualization, which means that there's a loss of self-awareness and you start to become more like the group, which means that you get more, your abilities and everything start being centered around the group, and which means that there's more group cohesiveness, but then that means that there's not much depth for improvement. This also links to groupthink, meaning that it practices group polarization, which means that everyone in the group has same thoughts and it's fixed. It's hard to get out of the group once you're in it because you start acting with similar movements, similar ideas, and when you're, for example, when you're in a bottom group and your academic abilities per se, they aren't as great, and you're surrounded by people whose academic abilities aren't great either, then you're going to stay in an environment that's fixed. There's no room for improvement. And that's the problem with tracking, because when you're with the people of your own abilities, it's hard to get above that. You want to be around people who are different than you so that you can progress and do better. And also increase the proximity between students of all different types of abilities and intellect. All of these criteria leads to decreasing the students' motivation to do well in school and further education, because they're constantly surrounded by people who are alike to them, who have similar abilities, and that doesn't give much room for them to really go further and prove everyone wrong, because they're constantly surrounded by people with the same beliefs and abilities. Most of the time, those who are in the lower groups tend to think that their capabilities are very limited, which is very bad for a student who's only very young and they still have a lot to learn, a lot to grow. And having a fixed mindset so early in life hinders them from doing well in the future. That's why tracking is an issue, because keeping kids with same abilities in separate groups doesn't give much scope for them to go more into education, more in depth into solving difficult tasks and stepping outside of their comfort zones.
Some pros and cons of tracking. With tracking, students feel more comfortable and learn better when they're grouped with peers of similar abilities. It also enables teachers to adjust instruction to the needs of the groups of students. It also is easier to accommodate slower learners, which in turn may help with social cohesiveness. Now, because tracking has been around for some time, transition to mixed group abilities grouping may hurt gifted or high achieving students who have done well in an accelerated program of studying. Now, there are some cons to tracking as well. The labels that students are given on an early stage will stay with them as they move on from grade to grade. These students will tend to internalize these labels, which will cause them to have lower self-esteem than their peers. The talents of late bloomers or lower students may also go undiscovered as they will be placed in lower tracks. Those in lower tracks will also continue to have low expectations of themselves, which will lead them to with low motivation to do well in school. This will lower their self-verification motivation, and the language that is used by teachers that they may hear may also cause them to have negative effects on their self-esteem. Low achieving students have also been proven to do better when learning alongside higher achieving students. Tracking assignments are also not always determined by academic ability, as said earlier. They could also be decided by their race. Member diversity in groups also will help with problem solving, which is important in places like school.
So what is the connection between tracking and social psychology, you may find yourself asking? Well, the group that a student ends up in could affect how the student will develop socially. For example, the top group is likely to become close-minded. They may also indulge more in corfing or cutting off reflected failure, and berging or basking in reflected glory. Meanwhile, a lower group could develop self-esteem issues or for not being in a higher level class. There is also a chance for stagnation due to lack of a challenge given to lower level students.
Tracking is also connected to social norms. By staying in a group, it is determined what is accepted and what isn't accepted in the group, what a student can or cannot do in the group. Sometimes being too smart for the group is also bad because they are constantly surrounded by people who are similar to them, and therefore they think that they should be the same as them too, instead of thinking, oh, maybe I should get better and go to the other group. This is the kind of influence group has on a group member's mindset. Sometimes staying in the group too long and adapting to social norms all the time can inflict stereotypes of the group. The students that are in the higher, more challenging group may start to think that these social norms are the stereotypes of those who are usually in the lower ability groups. This isn't healthy for those who are in the lower groups because it lowers their self-esteem and lowers their motivation to do well in school, because the upper groups are making stereotypes and assumptions about them. The topic of tracking also relates to social roles, where the group members of these lower groups are expected to fulfill expectations of the leader, who in this case is the teacher usually. The teacher determines why they are in the group that they're in. Therefore, in order to establish the reason why they were put in the group in the first place, they are expected to do all these social roles that the teacher expects from them, like not being so good in a certain subject because that's why the teacher put them in this group. Sometimes being in these groups inflicts cognitive dissonance in these students because they're confused on whether to do what is expected of a group and of the teacher versus defeating the status quo and improving and breaking bounds of the group. It's always a struggle and it's always frustrating for students who are in the lower groups and who are trying to get to the top group, but they're always afraid of whether it's more important to fit into the group that you're in or whether it's more important to try and break the boundaries and be more educationally adept.
There's been a few attempts to solving the issue with academic tracking. Maureen Hallinan, a professor of sociology emeritus at the University of Notre Dame, suggested reform in order to counteract the negative consequences of tracking as listed earlier. She believed that as long as students were engaged in some sort of integrated setting, the negative effects of segregation could be avoided. Another professor, this time from Cambridge, Alan Grobard, believed that an entirely new system should be put in place with small schools established within larger school systems. These smaller schools would allow students to select programs that cover both traditional learning as well as real-world experience type learning. Now, our solution takes a slightly different approach. To put it simply, we believe that we need to reduce classical conditioning of the students while increasing each student's private self-awareness as well as eliminating post-decision dissonance.
Again, the system may have worked in the past because of where America was technologically and industrially. However, times are changing and the world is advancing at a rapid rate. Many of the jobs that were needed in the past are no longer necessary for this economy. The system of education is so outdated and it's ignorant that the world is changing and that through that the schools need to change too. The problem is, since we are in denial that we need new schools, we have been stuck in a time where lower track students are negatively affected and racial gaps in tracks are evident. At the end of the day, it is an issue of racism, classism that affects America. To get rid of track schools is necessary in order to bring change and embrace the new world.